Imagine ladies needing specially altered doors just to walk into a room. Their hats were that tall. Preachers actually claimed that demons would happily roost on the tips of certain fashionable headpieces. Some women wore headdresses so wide they resembled majestic butterflies about to take flight, constructed with delicate wires and sheer floating fabrics. We're talking about actual gold and precious jewels woven into hair coverings, making a single headpiece worth more than a commoner's entire yearly earnings. Number 7. The sky-high hennin, reaching for the heavens, literally. Picture this. It's the 15th century, and you see a noblewoman approaching. But what catches your eye first isn't her gown. It's the towering cone, a steeple perched elegantly on her head. This was the hennin, and it was a serious status symbol, especially in Burgundy and France. These weren't just little party hats. We're talking structures that could reach up to 3 feet, or even reported 4 feet in some extreme cases. Think of it as a personal skyscraper. The classic hennin was a truncated cone, often made from a light frame of wire or wicker, then covered in rich fabrics like silk, velvet, or brocade. Sometimes, instead of a cone, it was a tall, cylindrical shape, often with a flattened top, known as a chimney pot hennin. The really fancy ones didn't stop there. A long, flowing veil, often made of fine linen, gauze, or silk, would be artfully draped from the very tip of the hennin, sometimes cascading all the way down to the floor, or even trailing behind the wearer like a bridal train. These veils, called sachentage or similar names, could be incredibly sheer and light, adding an ethereal, almost ghostly quality to the wearer's appearance. The angle of the hennin on the head was also a matter of fashion. It was typically worn tilted back at a rather fetching angle, revealing the hairline at the front. To achieve this look, the front hair right up to the crown was often plucked or shaved to create a high, fashionably bare forehead. Any stray hairs peeking out were a no-no. Sometimes a small, dark velvet loop or a band of fabric, called a frontlet or fillet, was visible just at the edge of the hennin, framing the face and contrasting with the pale forehead. The height of your hennin was no accident. It often signaled your rank. Princesses and queens might sport the tallest, most extravagant versions, while women of lower nobility would wear more modest, though still impressive, cones. Sumptuary laws, those rules dictating what people of different classes could wear, sometimes even specified hennin heights. Imagine a law telling you your hat can only be 2 feet tall because you're not a duchess. Wearing such a contraption wasn't without its challenges. Doorways, as mentioned, could be a real issue. Ladies had to develop a graceful stoop or sideways shuffle to navigate them. Windy days must have been an absolute nightmare, turning a fashionable statement into a potential weather vane. And think about sitting down or dancing. It required immense poise and careful movement. The sheer weight, even with light materials, could be a strain on the neck over a long day. Despite the practical difficulties, the hennin remained a dominant fashion for noblewomen for a good chunk of the 15th century. Its dramatic silhouette is one of the most recognizable images from the late medieval period, a testament to the lengths women would go to for fashion and status. Different regions had their variations too. While most popular in France, Burgundy, and the Low Countries versions appeared in England and other parts of Europe, sometimes shorter, sometimes with different veil arrangements. The sheer audacity of its height made it a powerful statement of wealth and social standing in a very visual era. Number 6. The butterfly headdress, taking flight with fabric and wire. If you thought the hennin was a bit much, get ready for its whimsical, airy cousin, the butterfly headdress. Emerging in the latter half of the 15th century, particularly favored by Burgundian court ladies, this style took the concept of a prominent headpiece and gave it wings quite literally. It was a delicate, ethereal creation that made the wearer look like a fantastical creature ready to flutter away. The core of the butterfly headdress often involved a smaller, more manageable cap, or a truncated hennin as a base. This base might be a jeweled caul, a small cone, or even a pillbox-like structure. The real magic, however, was in the wings. These were created from fine, translucent fabrics, think gossamer, thin silk gauze or starched linen stretched taut over a delicate wire frame. This frame was shaped to resemble the open wings of a butterfly, arching up and outwards from the back or sides of the head. Imagine the effect. As the lady moved, these sheer wings would float and shimmer, catching the light. They were often unadorned to emphasize their lightness and transparency. But sometimes the edges might be subtly wired with gold or silver thread, or perhaps tiny pearls were sewn along the framework. The sheer volume of these wings could be impressive, extending quite far out from the head. The hair beneath was usually styled very severely to accommodate the structure. Often, the hair was pulled back tightly, perhaps braided and pinned up, and the forehead was plucked high, similar to the fashion with hennins, to create a smooth, uninterrupted line for the headdress to sit upon. The focus was entirely on the fantastical silhouette created by the headdress itself. Wearing a butterfly headdress required a certain grace. While lighter than a solid tall hennin, the wide span of the wings meant navigating crowded rooms or windy courtyards would still be a delicate operation. A sudden gust of wind could threaten to send the whole confection askew, or worse, damage the fragile wire and fabric. And imagine trying to get close to someone for a conversation. You'd need a wide berth. This headdress was a symbol of high fashion and aristocratic refinement. It was less about towering height and more about delicate artistry and an almost playful extravagance. The materials, though seemingly light, were expensive. Fine silk gauze was a luxury item, and the construction of the wire frames required skilled craftsmanship. It was a look that screamed wealth and leisure, indicating that the wearer didn't need to engage in any form of manual labor. Contemporary depictions in paintings and illuminated manuscripts show these headdresses in stunning detail, often worn at courtly events, feasts, and celebrations. They lent an air of otherworldly beauty to the women who wore them, transforming their appearance into something almost mythical. The butterfly headdress represents a fascinating moment in medieval fashion where structure, material, and imagination combined to create something truly unique and visually arresting. A fleeting trend that left a lasting impression of delicate grandeur. It was a high-maintenance look, certainly, but one that perfectly captured the late medieval love for display and intricate design. Number 5. The escoffion, padded rolls, horns, and hearts of pure luxury. The escoffion was less a single defined headdress and more a category of elaborate, often padded headwear popular in the late 14th and 15th centuries. Think of it as the plush, sculptural cousin to the more rigid hennin. These weren't just simple hats. They were often large, padded rolls of fabric, frequently shaped into striking forms like hearts, crescents, or, most famously, horns. They were all about volume, rich materials, and promoting a lady's wealth and fashion forwardness. At its most basic, an escoffion could be a thick, decorated roll of fabric called a bourrelet, which means padded roll in French, worn like a crown or encircling the head. This roll could be stuffed with wool, tow, or other light materials to give it its distinctive shape and volume. The fabric covering this roll was where the luxury really shone, rich velvets, silks, brocades, often embroidered with gold or silver thread and studded with pearls, gemstones, and enamel plaques. One of the most recognizable forms of the escoffion was the horned variety. These weren't necessarily sharp, demonic horns, but rather large, curving protrusions on either side of the head, created by the padded structure. The hair was often divided and plaited, with each plait then coiled or looped up and encased within these horns of fabric, or the escoffion itself was shaped to give this bicornuate, two-horned appearance. Sometimes, these horns rose high above the temples, and a veil might be draped over them or between them, adding further complexity to the silhouette. Then there was the heart-shaped escoffion. This version saw the padded roll shaped to dip in the center front and rise up on either side, creating a distinct heart outline around the upper part of the face. This style was particularly popular in the mid-15th century and is often seen in portraits of noblewomen from that era. Like other escotchons, it would be made from luxurious materials and heavily ornamented. Beneath these impressive structures, the hair was often meticulously managed. It might be braided and coiled tightly to fit under or within the escoffion, or sometimes hairpieces were used to add volume if the lady's natural hair wasn't sufficient to fill out the desired shape. As with many headdresses of the period, a high plucked forehead was often fashionable, emphasizing the shape of the escoffion itself. The sheer size and opulence of some escotchons were astounding. They could be incredibly wide, making movement in tight spaces a challenge. Imagine trying to turn your head quickly, with a large padded structure laden with jewels balanced on top. These were not practical items for daily chores, but were designed for courtly life, for display at feasts, tournaments, and other grand occasions. Moralists and clergy often took issue with these extravagant headpieces, particularly the horned versions. They saw them as symbols of vanity and pride, and some even preached that the horns were places for devils to perch. Despite such condemnations, the escoffion in its various forms remained highly fashionable among aristocratic women, a clear visual statement of their status and their ability to afford such elaborate and non-functional attire. The diversity of shapes within the escoffion category, from simple padded rolls to elaborate horned and heart-shaped creations, demonstrates the incredible creativity and love for ornamentation that characterized late medieval fashion. Each one was a unique piece of wearable art. Number 4. The horned headdress, devilishly fashionable points. While the escoffion often featured rounded, padded horns, there was a more distinct and often more controversial style known simply as the horned headdress, where the horns were more defined, sometimes sharper, and a very deliberate part of the silhouette. Popular across various parts of Europe, especially in the 14th and early 15th centuries, these headdresses caused quite a stir, not just for their appearance, but for what they were perceived to represent. These horns weren't typically made from actual animal horns, of course. They were constructed from fabric wire frames and padding, or sometimes the hair itself was elaborately styled and stiffened to create horn-like projections on either side of the head. The hair would be parted in the center, then each side braided or coiled. These coils could then be built up and shaped, sometimes over internal supports, to form two distinct points or rounded horns that rose upwards and outwards from the temples or the top of the head. Often, these horned hairs were then covered or augmented with rich fabrics, nets of pearls, or jeweled cauls that emphasized their shape. A veil was frequently draped over the horns or suspended between them, sometimes creating a dramatic, almost wing-like effect, or softening the severity of the points. The variety was immense. Some horns were tall and pointed, others were broader and more rounded, some curved forwards, others swept back. The visual impact was undeniably striking. It created a wide, almost animalistic silhouette that was a far cry from the demure veiled heads often associated with earlier medieval periods. This boldness was part of its appeal for fashionable women, but it was also what drew the ire of contemporary critics. Clergymen, in particular, had a field day with horned headdresses. They were seen as symbols of vanity, extravagance, and even demonic influence. Fiery sermons were preached against them. One famous moralist, the Carmelite friar Thomas Connected, was known for his virulent attacks on these headdresses in the early 15th century. He would incite crowds, and sometimes children, to mock and even throw things at women wearing them. He supposedly preached that these horns were where devils loved to sit, or that women wearing them were like horned beasts from the apocalypse. Despite such vehement condemnation, the fashion persisted for decades. Noblewomen and wealthy bourgeois women clearly found the style alluring enough to brave the criticism. The horned headdress was a powerful fashion statement, a way to stand out and display one's wealth and daring. The materials used, silks, velvets, gold thread, pearls, gemstones, all contributed to the sense of luxury. Sumptuary laws, which aimed to control extravagance in dress, according to social rank, sometimes also targeted horned headdresses, attempting to limit their size or the richness of their materials. However, enforcing these laws was often difficult, and fashion-conscious women frequently found ways around them. The construction of these headdresses was complex. It required careful shaping of the hair or a supporting frame, skillful application of fabrics and jewels, and a certain amount of courage to wear. The wearer's own hair was integral, often forming the base structure, which was then enhanced and decorated. This meant a significant amount of time and effort went into creating the look each day or for special occasions. The horned headdress remains one of the most controversial and talked about fashions of the medieval period. It highlights the tension between personal expression, social status, and religious or moral expectations in an era where clothing was a potent form of communication. Whether seen as beautiful, monstrous, or ridiculously vain, there is no denying that the horned headdress was an unforgettable and truly elaborate statement. Number 3. The crispinet and caul, hair encased in jeweled cages. Imagine your hair not just styled but encased, beautifully, intricately encased in what amounted to jeweled cages on either side of your head. This was the essence of the crispinet and the caul. Fashionable hair coverings from the 14th and 15th centuries that turned a woman's tresses into ornate architectural elements. These weren't about hiding the hair completely like a wimple, but rather about containing and decorating it in a very structured and visible way. The crispinet, or crespin, typically referred to a pair of decorative hairnets, or mesh bags, one for each side of the head. A woman's hair would be parted down the middle, plaited, and then each plait would be coiled or bunched up and tucked into its own crispinet. These crispinets were often attached to a headband or fillet that went around the head, holding them securely in place over the ears, or slightly towards the back of the head. What made crispinets so elaborate was their material and decoration. They were not simple hairnets. They were often made of fine silk, mesh, gold or silver wire, or intricately woven gold thread. And then came the bling. Pearls were a favorite, sewn into the mesh in patterns or outlining the edges. Small gemstones, beads, and enamel work could also adorn them. Essentially, a woman was wearing two small, glittering treasure chests on her head. The caul was a similar concept but could refer to a single larger head covering that encased all the hair at the back, or it could be a more general term for these kinds of decorative hairnets. Sometimes, caul and crispinet were used interchangeably, or a crispinet might be considered a type of caul. The key idea was a net-like structure that held the hair while also showing it off through the mesh, all while being lavishly decorated. These styles often left the top of the head bare or covered with a simple band, allowing a veil to be draped over the entire arrangement if desired. Sometimes the crispinets, or cauls, were so substantial and decorative that they formed the main headdress with perhaps only a very fine sheer veil added for modesty or extra flair. The shape of the hair within the crispinets could vary. Sometimes it created two distinct round or cylindrical bulges at the sides of the head. Other times, the encased hair might be shaped more squarely or even elongated. This fashion effectively widened the appearance of the head, creating a distinctive silhouette that is very characteristic of the period. Wealthy women, from queens and noblewomen down to the prosperous merchant class, embraced these styles. The cost of a pair of crispinets or a fine caul could be considerable, depending on the materials used. Those made with real gold thread and studded with numerous pearls and gems were significant investments and clear indicators of status. Putting them on would have been a process. The hair needed to be carefully divided, plaited, and coiled to fit neatly into the nets. The crispinets then had to be secured. This wasn't a quick hair. It required time and probably the assistance of a maid. Like other extravagant fashions, these didn't escape criticism from moralists, who saw them as yet another example of female vanity. However, their popularity endured for a considerable time, evolving in shape and decoration. They are frequently depicted in illuminated manuscripts, effigies, and paintings, giving us a clear idea of their appearance and the richness of their construction. The crispinet and caul represent a fascinating approach to gaiting, where the container became as important, if not more so, than the hair itself. It was a way to display wealth directly on one's head, transforming hair into a framework for elaborate, jewel-encrusted ornamentation, a truly medieval take on bling. The artistry involved in crafting these delicate yet strong nets, and the skill in arranging the hair within them, made them one of the most intricate and visibly luxurious head adornments of the era. Number 2. Templars and structured. Side coils. Architectural hair. Before the towering hennins and dramatic horns took center stage, and sometimes alongside them, a fashion for highly structured and ornamented side coils of hair, often emphasized by decorative plaques called templars, was all the rage, particularly in the 14th and early 15th centuries. This style turned a woman's hair into a pair of symmetrical prominent features flanking her face, almost like architectural supports for her head. The basic idea involved parting the hair down the center, then braiding or coiling each half. These braids or coils were not left to hang loose, nor were they simply pinned up at the back. Instead, they were meticulously arranged into firm, often round or rectangular shapes positioned over the ears or temples, hence the name Templars for the ornaments that often covered them. These side coils or buns could be quite large and solid-looking. Sometimes the woman's own hair was sufficient, but often false hair or padding was used to achieve the desired volume and perfect symmetry. The goal was a smooth, controlled, and very deliberate shape on each side of the head. This is where the Templars came in. Templars were ornamental plaques, often circular or square, made from metal, like gold or silver, enamel, or other precious materials. They were frequently decorated with gemstones, pearls, or intricate designs. These plaques were placed directly over the coiled hair at the temples, serving both as a decorative element and sometimes helping to keep the coils in place. They acted like jeweled hubcaps for the hair. The overall effect could be quite striking. The face would be framed by these two prominent, decorated masses of hair. A fillet or headband was often worn across the forehead, sometimes connecting the two Templars or providing a base for them. Veils were commonly worn with this style, as well artfully draped over the structured hair, sometimes leaving the Templars visible, other times partially obscuring them to create a softer look. This wasn't just a casual hairstyle, it was a carefully constructed coiffure. Achieving the perfect shape and symmetry required skill and time. The hair had to be tightly braided and coiled to maintain its form throughout the day. The Templars themselves were valuable items, touting the wearer's wealth. This fashion was popular across much of Western Europe. You can see it in countless effigies on tombs, in illuminated manuscripts, and in early panel paintings. Queens, noblewomen, and wealthy merchant wives all sported variations of this look. The size and elaborateness of the Templars and the side coils could indicate social standing. Sometimes, instead of distinct Templars, the coiled hair itself was encased in richly decorated cauls or nets on each side, similar to crispinets, but often with a more solid sculpted appearance. The key was the bilateral symmetry and the prominence of these side features. Wearing such a style would have affected posture and movement. While perhaps not as unwieldy as a very tall hennin, the width and rigidity of the side coils meant a certain formality in how one held one's head. Turning the head quickly might have been less than graceful. This focus on elaborately dressed side hair sections highlights a particular medieval aesthetic that emphasized width at the temples. It was a fashion that framed the face in a very specific way, drawing attention to the eyes and forehead, which, as usual, was often fashionably high and plucked. The Templars and structured side coils were a testament to the medieval love of order, symmetry, and rich ornamentation, transforming human hair into a rigid, jewel-adorned sculpture. It was a serious, stately kind of glamour. Number 1. The elaborate wimple, veil, and barbette ensemble, layers of meaning and mystery. While a simple wimple and veil might sound modest in the hands of medieval women of status, this combination could become an incredibly elaborate and imposing headdress, a complex sculpture of fabric that conveyed dignity, piety, and social standing. Popular for centuries, but reaching particular heights of complexity in the 12th to 14th centuries, and continuing for widows and older women later on. This wasn't just about covering up, it was about artful draping and layering. The wimple itself was a piece of cloth, usually linen or silk, that was worn around the neck and chin, sometimes covering the throat and extending up to frame the face. It could be pinned in place at the sides of the head or at the top. The barbette was a linen band that passed under the chin and was pinned on top of the head, or sometimes it was a more substantial chin band that formed part of the wimple structure. Then came the veil, or often multiple veils. These were not just casually thrown over the head. They were strategically draped, folded and pinned over the wimple and barbette, and sometimes over an additional fillet, a stiffened band, or a small cap that gave structure to the whole arrangement. The quality of the fabric, fine linen, crisp silk, or even richer materials for the very wealthy, was crucial. The sheer amount of fabric used could be substantial. Imagine the layers. First, the hair would be neatly braided and pinned up, often completely hidden. Then the barbette might be fixed, followed by the wimple, carefully arranged to cover the neck and chin smoothly. Over this, a primary veil would be draped, perhaps falling to the shoulders or even further down the back and sides. Sometimes a second, finer veil, perhaps of silk gauze, would be layered on top, adding texture and opacity. The way these elements were pinned and folded was an art form. Some styles created soft folds around the face, while others were more architectural, with crisp lines and defined shapes. The fillet worn underneath could dictate the shape of the veil on top, sometimes creating a flat-topped appearance or a more rounded silhouette. For queens and very high-ranking noblewomen, these veiled headdresses could be further adorned with jeweled circlets or crowns worn over the veil. This elaborate layering wasn't just for show. It carried significant social and symbolic meaning. For married women, it signified modesty and respectability. For widows, it was a sign of mourning and continued decorum. For nuns and other religious women, it was a symbol of their renunciation of worldly vanities. However, even within these contexts of modesty, the richness of the fabric and the complexity of the draping could still communicate wealth and status. A queen's wimple and veil, made from the finest imported silk and perfectly arranged, was a world away from a peasant woman's simple linen kerchief. The sheer coverage of these headdresses meant that only the face was visible. This created an air of mystery and formality. It also must have been quite warm and somewhat restrictive. Hearing might have been slightly muffled and peripheral vision limited. Eating and drinking would require care to avoid soiling the pristine white linen that was often favored, especially for the wimple and barbette. Keeping these linen elements impeccably clean and sharply pressed was itself a sign of a well-maintained household and status. While later medieval fashions moved towards revealing more hair, embracing more flamboyant structures like hennins and escutcheons, the tradition of elaborate veiled headdresses continued, particularly for older women, widows, and in formal or ceremonial contexts. Even queens in the 15th century might be depicted in formal portraits with complex layered veils over a jeweled berlet or cap. The enduring power of the wimple, veil, and barbette ensemble lay in its versatility and its capacity to convey complex social messages through subtle variations in fabric drape and layering. It was a headdress that could be both profoundly modest and impressively stately, a testament to the medieval ability to transform simple pieces of cloth into elaborate statements of identity and position. It truly was a case of the whole being far greater and far more intricate than the sum of its parts.